they announced my assignment on a Tuesday, which was the least dignified day they could have chosen for what was apparently the most embarrassing post in the Soren Imperial Guard, consort escort, second tier. I did not know what it meant until the adjutant, a tall, gray-skinned officer named Phaloris, leaned toward me with something between pity and amusement in his large, reflective eyes and said, quietly, "It means you stand behind her chair at state functions and you do not speak." I was Garrett Oakes, 29 years old, a sergeant of the 1st Terran Liaison Corps, on secondment to the Soren Imperial Court, because some treaty clause required a human face in the palace and I had drawn the short straw at a briefing I had not been paying quite enough attention to. I was not tall by human standards, not decorated. I had a scar across my jaw from a perimeter breach at the Vethis outpost 3 years prior, and I wore it the way most soldiers wear their scars, without thinking about it. I had brown eyes, dark hair going gray at one temple, and hands that had done more work than ceremony. Phaloris handed me a uniform I did not recognize, in the palace's deep crimson with copper piping, and told me I was expected in the consort hall at the 8th bell. "What does the position actually require?" I asked. "Presence," he said. Nothing more. He meant it as a comfort. It did not land that way. I found out about the laughter later. Not all at once, it came to me in pieces, the way rumors always do in a palace. A page who glanced at me too long, a kitchen worker who looked away when I passed, a junior air officer who covered her mouth when I walked into the briefing room in my new uniform, then schooled her expression and pretended she had been coughing. The story, as I eventually assembled it: Queen Valith Soren had been presented with 4 consort candidates by the Imperial Matching Council, all of them sons of great houses, all of them decorated and pedigreed and tall, in the way Soren nobles are tall, which is to say a head above most humans. She had reviewed their credentials in open court. She had dismissed 3 of them in the same breath: too ambitious, too weak-willed, too obviously after the seat. The 4th she had dismissed by saying, in front of the full assembled court, that she had no use for another man who would require managing. The council had then, under the treaty obligation, offered the human liaison post, a consort escort, symbolic, no lineage implications, no succession risk. She had agreed without reading my file. There was a line she had said. I heard it from 2 separate sources, which meant it was accurate. She had looked at the summary card, height, service record, species, human, and said, "Fine, set the weakest one behind my chair. At least he will not try to speak." That was the joke. Set the weakest one behind my chair. It had spread through the court in an afternoon. I did not take it as an insult. Not then. I had been a soldier for 9 years, and I had stopped keeping score of what people thought of me, somewhere around year 3. What mattered was the assignment, and what the assignment required, and whether I could do it with some measure of competence. Everything else was noise. So I stood behind her chair at the 8th bell in the consort hall, and I did not speak. She was remarkable, in the way that people who have carried authority for a long time become remarkable. Not in the way of beauty, though she was that too, in the angular, precise way of the Sorene High Court, with pale gray skin that caught the chandelier light like still water, and gold eyes that moved through a room the way a commander's eyes move, cataloging. Her hair was dark teal, worn in the intricate, wrapped style of a reigning queen, threaded with copper wire that matched the palace piping. She was perhaps 35 in human terms, perhaps 100 in her own, and she sat in her chair at the head of the court table the way people sit in chairs they have sat in since they were children, like it was the most natural place in any room. She did not look at me once during that first function, which was, as far as I was concerned, entirely professional. I stood. The function lasted 4 hours. I moved when she moved, stood when she stood, sat in the corner on the small secondary chair when the formal portion broke into conversation. I drank nothing. I ate nothing. I watched the room the way I had been trained to watch rooms, which is from the outside in, all edges before centers, exits before entrances. At the end of the evening, when the last guest had been seen to the corridor, she stood, gathered her formal papers, and walked past me without comment. 3 steps past, she stopped. She did not turn around. She said to the middle distance, "You have been watching the Kethrani ambassador's aide since the 2nd hour." "Yes," I said. A pause. Then, "Why? He's been counting the guards." Not the way a curious guest counts them. The way someone counts them who needs to know if they're enough. Another pause. Longer. She turned then, fractionally, so that I could see the side of her face and the gold of one eye. Dolores briefed you on Kathrani politics? No. I read the public diplomatic register and 2 years of border incident reports on the transit from Earth. She said nothing. She turned back and continued walking. That was the first conversation. For 3 weeks, it was the only kind we had. Her noting something she had seen, me noting the same thing in different words, both of us establishing that we had been watching the same room. She never thanked me. I never expected it. At the end of each function, she would say something. I would respond, and then she would leave, and I would file a brief observation report with Dolores, who read them with the expression of a man who did not know what to do with them. The reports were specific, not narrative. I am not a narrative man, but operational. The Kathrani delegation was running 3 junior staff members who appeared on no official roster. The dietary arrangements at the second reception had been altered at the last moment by someone in the kitchen staff who was, according to the rotation log, not scheduled that day. The guard rotation at the Eastern Palace Gate had a 14-minute gap every third evening that corresponded to a shift change overlap that had never been corrected. None of these things were, individually, alarming. Patterns are assembled from details, and the details were accumulating, and I wrote them down because that was what you did when you had a post and an eye and a pencil. Dolores kept receiving the reports. He kept not actioning them. I did not press him on it. He was managing 4 times more complexity than I was, and the Terran consort escort was, in the architecture of the palace, a very small bracket indeed. I understood my position in the structure. I worked within it. The joke in the court continued. I was the weakest choice. It had become something of a casual cruelty, the kind that is not directed at its target, because its target is not considered important enough to address directly. I overheard it in corridors. I saw it in the way certain advisors looked past me when they addressed the Queen. Once, at a formal reception, a Soren lord named David Kirill, heir to the third house, one of the dismissed consort candidates, made a point of standing close to my position and saying to his companion, loudly enough to carry, that the Queen had certainly chosen quantity over quality in her Terran arrangement. His companion laughed. I did not move. I did not change my expression. I kept watching the room. Later, Valeth walked past me and said under her breath, "You heard that?" "Yes." "You said nothing." "It wasn't my function to say something." She stopped. She looked at me directly then, for what I think was the first time. Not past me, not through me, not the catalog glance she gave everything in a room. She looked at me the way you look at something you have been using as furniture and have abruptly realized might be a door. She said, "What is your function, Sergeant?" "To stand behind your chair," I said, "and to not speak unless spoken to." She held that look for 3 seconds. Then she walked on. The situation with David Kirill deteriorated over the following month in the way these things deteriorate when a man is accustomed to getting what he wants. He had not accepted his dismissal from the consort candidates quietly. He had the kind of grievance that does not argue openly. It maneuvers. There were procedural objections to treaty obligations filed with the council. There were quiet conversations in corners. There were, Dolores eventually told me with a carefully neutral face, certain requests that the Terran consort arrangement be reviewed. "He wants the slot," I said. "He wants access to the Queen," Dolores corrected, which was a more precise and therefore more troubling statement. The situation crystallized at the Mountain Court. The Mountain Court was a semi-annual tradition. The Queen and a smaller retinue traveled to the fortress at Voren's Pass, 2 days from the capital, for a session of border agreements and a formal territorial review with the 4 houses whose land abutted the pass. It was old ceremony, older than the current dynasty. The fortress was stone and cold, and sat at an altitude where the air bit at you if you stood still too long. I had been assigned to the traveling retinue, as a matter of course, still standing behind the chair, still not speaking unless spoken to. Devkarif Kirill had also been invited. His house held the pass agreement for the eastern flank. There was no procedural way to exclude him. I watched him the first evening of the Mountain Court, the way I had watched the Kathrani aide, and what I saw was the same shape of thing, a man counting edges, counting people, calculating what was present and what was not. What was not present at Voren's Pass, the full palace guard complement. The travel retinue ran at 1/3 of the capital staff. There were 8 guards for the Queen's direct perimeter, where the capital ran 24. There were 2 officers and no senior commanders, because senior commanders stayed with the seat of power, and the traveling court was considered ceremonial. I wrote a brief to Phalorus that night. I noted what I had observed. I noted the reduction in the perimeter. I noted Kirill's movements and the 3 separate conversations he had held with members of his house guard who were not, technically, supposed to be inside the fortress, but had been admitted under the border staff exception. Phalorus read it. He thanked me. He did not act on it. On the second morning of the Mountain Court, at the territorial review session, I stood behind the chair and watched Kirill take his seat at the long stone table and understood from the way he arranged himself. Shoulders set, chin up, the particular stillness of a man who has decided that the meeting was going to be used for something other than border agreements. He waited until the mid-session break. The room's complement shifted, junior staff stepping out, senior negotiators stretching, the natural gap that opens in long formal sessions. The Queen was speaking with her chief counselor at the far end of the table, 6 guards at the door, 2 at the window embrasures. Kirill rose and moved toward her with a deliberateness that was dressed up as casual, and I moved first. I had not been authorized to move. My function was the chair. I stepped around the chair and into the space between Kirill and the Queen before he had covered half the distance, and I stopped, and I stood, and I said nothing. He stopped. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has been interrupted by a piece of furniture. "Stand aside," he said. "I need to address the Queen." "The Queen is in session," I said. "Formal address happens at the table. This is a private matter. Then it happens at a scheduled private audience." He looked at me the way he had looked at me every time I was visible to him, as something that did not merit full attention. He said, "You are a consort's escort. You have no authority here." "I have authority over the 2 meters around the Queen's person," I said. "That's the consort escort compact. Article 4. You're welcome to check it." I had in fact read the compact. All of it. On the first transit, on the same evening I read the diplomatic register and the border incident reports. He stared at me. I watched his face do the calculation. Scene versus strategy. The math of whether forcing the issue publicly was worth what it would cost him. He was accustomed, I thought, to people being impressed by his height and his house name. He had not built a plan for the version of this where the obstacle just stood there and did not move. The room had gone quiet. The remaining counselors at the table were watching. 2 of the guards at the door had shifted their weight in the barely perceptible way guards shift when they are paying attention, but have not yet been given cause to act. I was aware of all of this the way I was aware of most things in Rumsems, as information, not as pressure. He had not expected resistance. More than that, he had not expected competence. I was the weakest choice. The weakest choice did not cite compact articles and plant its feet and look at you with an expression that contained absolutely no interest in what you thought of it. He said, "This is not finished," and walked back to his seat. I returned to my position. Valeth had turned. She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before, which was not exactly the gold-eye catalog glance and not exactly calculation. It was something slower. She said nothing. She turned back to her counselor. "What happened that night is a matter of formal record now, and I will not pretend I handled it elegantly. What I will say is that I had moved my sleeping position from the guest quarters to the corridor outside the Queen's chamber at Varennes Pass, because the guest quarters were 3 rooms away, and that distance was wrong with 8 guards instead of 24. I had not told anyone I was doing this. I had not asked permission. I had simply moved my kit and my coat and sat against the stone wall with my back to the door because that was the correct position. At the second hour of the night, 2 men moved through the corridor. They had palace staff credentials, and they should not have been in the residential wing after the first bell. I heard them before I saw them, the sound of people trying to be quiet who have not been trained in quiet. I stood. I said, in the steadiest voice I had, "Stop." They stopped. One of them said something I will not repeat. The other moved. What followed was not elegant. It was not clean. One of them had a blade, and I have a scar on my forearm now to prove it. The stone corridor was narrow enough to be an advantage, if you knew how to use a narrow corridor, and I had spent 2 years in close quarters training at Vithis, and 1 additional year learning, the hard way, that a confined space belongs to whoever decides it belongs to them. I decided early. By the time Phalorus Ulf arrived with 3 of the night guards at the noise. Both of them were on the floor, and I was standing in front of the queen's door, with blood on my sleeve and my back to the wood. Pheloris looked at me. He looked at the 2 men on the floor. He looked at my arm. "You were not assigned to the corridor," he said. "No," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll get a medic." The queen opened her door. She had heard the noise. She was in a sleeping robe, her teal hair loose and unbound, without the copper wire or the formal wrapped style, and she looked, for the first time since I had known her, like someone who had been woken, without warning, and not yet had time to put the queen back on. She looked at the 2 men on the floor. She looked at Pheloris. She looked at me, at my arm, at the blood. She said, "Garrett." It was the first time she had used my name. I noticed it the way you notice when a sound that has been absent your whole life suddenly arrives and you realize the silence was the thing that was wrong. "Your Majesty," I said. She looked at me for a very long time. Then she looked at Pheloris and said, in the voice that was entirely the queen now, all of the sleep gone from it, "Wake the commanders. Seal the fortress, and bring Kirill to the primary hall. Do not arrest him yet. I want him walking in under his own authority." Pheloris moved. The guards moved. She looked back at me. She said, "That arm needs seeing to. It's not deep." "I'm aware of what deep looks like," she said, with a dryness that was not unkind. "I'll know what it looks like when someone is standing straight, because they have decided to stand straight, not because standing is comfortable." I did not answer that. She stepped back from the door and held it open. It was not an invitation that brooked discussion. I went inside and sat in the chair she indicated, a plain wooden thing by the reading table, and a palace medic arrived in 4 minutes and did what medics do, which was clean and close and wrap, and it stung considerably, and I kept my face even because there were things I had decided about who I was a long time ago, and one of them was that I did not make noise about pain in front of people who were watching. The queen watched the medic work. She stood at the window with her arms crossed, looking out at the dark mountain pass, and she did not speak until the medic left. Then she said, "You read the consort escort compact?" "Yes, all of it." "Yes, Pheloris told me you submitted observation reports after every function." "I submitted them to Pheloris. If he passed them on, that was his judgment." "He passed them on," she said. "I read everyone." She was still looking at the window. "You noticed the Kethrani aide before I did. I had flagged him at the 3rd hour. You had him at the 2nd. She paused. "The border incident reports. You read 2 years' worth." "3," I said. "The register only goes back 2, but there are supplementary filings in the public record." She turned from the window. The gold eyes were doing the slow thing again, not the catalog. The other thing, the one I did not have a name for yet. "Why?" she said. "You were assigned to stand behind a chair." "I was assigned to a post," I said. "The post has a perimeter that is understood as it is maintained." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with a care that was new in her voice, and I had been cataloging the registers of her voice for weeks, the formal one, the administrative one, the cold one she used with advisors, who had disappointed her. "What did you think of me when you heard what I said about the weakest one?"
I considered the version of this where I said something diplomatic, and we both understood that I was.
Being diplomatic. She would see through it. She was too intelligent for anything but the true answer. "I thought you were doing what people in authority often do," I said. "You had a slot to fill, and you didn't consider it worth filling carefully." I didn't take it as personal. "It was careless," she said. "Not diplomatic. Careless. Yes," she said. "You should have left. Most people would have asked to be reassigned." "I had a post," I said. She looked at me. The gold eyes held for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "You walked into a corridor you were not assigned to and stood against a door all night because you had a post." "The perimeter was wrong," I said. 8 guards for a traveling court is not enough. I wrote it in the brief. Pheloris told me you wrote it." Her voice was very even. "He also told me he did not action it. He had other considerations." "Stop being generous about it," she said. "And there was a sharpness in it, but not an unkind one. The sharpness of someone who is tired of careful language at 2 in the morning. You identified the gap. You wrote the brief. It was ignored, and so you filled the gap yourself. With your body. Against 2 men who had a blade." "One blade," I said. "The other has a club." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the place where a smile might live, if it were given room. "One blade," she agreed. The mountain court reconvened in the primary hall at the 5th bell, before dawn, with the fortress sealed, and the border lords assembled, and David Carril, standing in the middle of the stone floor where the formal witness square was inlaid. The lamps were lit. The mountain cold came through the walls. He had been woken from sleep and had arrived in his court clothes, hastily arranged, and he stood in the witness square with the expression of a man calculating whether the situation could still be managed. It could not be managed. Phaloris's people had found the correspondence overnight, in the rooms of the two men I had put on the floor, in a cipher that turned out to be not very good. Carril had arranged for an incident that looked like an opportunistic crime, an incident in a traveling court where the Queen's unusual Terran escort happened to be stationed in guest quarters 3 rooms away. He had, I thought, done a thorough job of believing his own description of me. Valeth entered the hall last. She had put the Queen back on, the hair wrapped, the copper wire, the high formal collar of the court traveling robe. She sat in the traveling throne at the head of the hall, and I stood behind the chair, where I was assigned to stand, with a bandaged arm and a face that I kept even, and the hall was silent. She looked at Carril for a long time. Then she looked at the assembled lords and counselors and border officers, and everyone else who had been woken in the dark to stand in a cold stone hall at Voran's Pass, and she said, in a voice that needed no amplification, and did not ask for anything because it never had to, Lord Carril believed that my Terran consort escort was the weakest point in this court's perimeter. I would like the record to note that Lord Carril was misinformed. She looked back at Carril. She said, the Consort Compact, Article 4, was cited correctly and without hesitation. The gap in our perimeter was identified in writing 3 days ago and reported through proper channels. And when those channels failed, my consort escort repositioned himself to the corridor outside my chamber and remained there through the night, without orders, without authorization, and without complaint. Carril said nothing. What Lord Carril did not read, she continued, because it did not occur to him that a Terran liaison sergeant would have read it, was the supplementary filing in the Kethrani diplomatic register that indicated his house's eastern flank arrangement was contingent on access to this court. What Lord Carril did not account for was that the weakest choice was the only person in this court who understood completely that the perimeter was wrong. She let that sit in the cold air of the hall. Then she said, remove him. They removed him. It took 4 guards. He walked on his own, but barely, and I watched him go the way I watch things I do not need to think about again. When the hall had settled, Phaloris materialized at my left shoulder and said very quietly, she's going to say something. I know, I said. Try not to look surprised. I'll do my best. Valeth was looking at me. The entire hall was looking at her looking at me, which meant the entire hall was, by extension, looking at me, and I had been in enough rooms to know when a room has just recalibrated what it thinks it knows. She said, in the same carrying voice, to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone. It was brought to my attention some weeks ago that I described my consort escort as the weakest choice available to me. I would like that description updated for the record. I held my face even. She said, the court will address him accordingly. She did not say what accordingly meant. She did not have to. The lord to my left, an older woman of the second house, someone who had clearly been in courts long enough to know when the wind changed, turned to me and inclined her head in a very precise and formal gesture. The officer at the door did the same, without being asked. The counselors at the side table did it in a small private wave, one after another. Phaloris beside me made a sound that I believe was him trying not to laugh. I inclined my own head, once to the Queen, because that was the correct response, and because it was the only thing I trusted myself to do, without my voice, doing something I had not given it permission to do. After the session, after the lords had been seen to their quarters, and the formal record sealed, and the guards doubled by order of the Queen, she found me in the eastern corridor, where I had been standing and watching the pass through an arrow-slit window, because old habits. She said, you're watching the pass? Yes. We have doubled guards on the pass. I know. I wanted to see it confirmed. She stood beside me. There was perhaps a foot between us, and the cold coming off the stone, and the gray light of early morning beginning to find the mountain. She said, you could have asked to be reassigned. After what I said, I had a post. I know. I'm not asking why you stayed. I'm asking. She stopped. She looked at the pass. I'm asking if you understood what you were staying in. I thought about that. I thought about the uniform I hadn't recognized, and Phaloris's careful pity, and the sound of laughter I was not supposed to hear. Yes, I said. And you stayed? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The light was coming up on the mountain, slow and gray, the way dawn comes at altitude, when there are no clouds to pink it up. Just the cold, gradual arrival of the world becoming visible. She said, I do not know the Terran customs around this, whether what I am about to say has an equivalent. I'll follow the context, I said. She looked at me then, in the morning light. Not the catalog, not the slow calculation. Something I still do not have a precise word for, in any language I know, the look of someone who has been alone in a specific way for a long time, and has just found, in an unexpected direction, a room they did not know was there. She said, I named you the weakest choice because I was not paying attention. I was wrong in a way I do not intend to be again. That's a generous correction, I said. It is not generous. It is accurate. She paused. I am asking, Sergeant Oakes, if you would consider remaining. Not behind the chair, in a different capacity. A considered one this time. The mountain light was coming fully now. Far below, I could see the pass road and the doubled guard positions, confirmed, exactly where they should be, I said. I'd want to read the full compact for the revised position, obviously, she said. And I'd want the perimeter staffing reviewed. Not just for traveling court. The capital numbers are better, but there are gaps in the third shift rotation I noticed in the first week. I assumed you had noticed, she said. You may write that brief directly to me. Phaloris won't like that. Phaloris, she said, will adapt. And there it was, the corner of her mouth. And this time the smile had room, and it took it brief and real, and all the more notable for being rare. I looked at her. She looked at me. The mountain morning was cold and clear, and the pass below was guarded correctly, for the first time since we had arrived. Yes, I said, I'll stay. She nodded once. It was not a small nod. It was the nod of someone who has made a decision and means it the way they mean everything. Fully, without leaving a door open behind it, she said, Welcome to the post. Thank you, Your Majesty. Vailith, she said, when it is only us. I said nothing for a moment, because it was the kind of thing that deserves a moment. Then, Vailith. She looked out at the pass. I looked out at the pass. We stood in the morning cold together, two people who had both, in their separate ways, been watching the same room from the outside in for a very long time and found, at the end of a difficult night on a cold mountain, that they had been standing in the same corridor all along. I did not know, standing there, what the years would be. I did not know the forms and the functions and the councils still to come, or the second attempt on the eastern flank that we dealt with 6 months later, or the third shift rotation gap that I wrote up the following week, and that was corrected inside 4 days, or the slow and careful and entirely dignified thing that grew in the space between two people who had each learned, independently, not to expect anything, and had then been surprised by something worth keeping. I knew the pass was guarded. I knew the brief had been delivered. I knew I had a post, and I intended to keep it. That was enough. It was, in the long run, more than enough. It was everything.